arrows, or there could be letters like on this computer. That's basically telling you what screws you need to remove to get the motherboard off. The motherboard has many screws if you look at it from the top, but you only need to take a few of them off to get the motherboard off. And it's usually marked on the motherboard by white arrows. In this case, it was marked with the letter PA. Now this little piece here is just an extension for the battery. Now we're going to remove all the screws on the motherboard marked with PA. And when it looks like we have them all, try to pull the motherboard out of the case, gently. And you'll start to feel where the pressure is coming from if there's any other screws holding it in. And what this is here is the processor and heatsink and CPU fan. It usually all comes off in one big device and snaps onto the motherboard with a cable there. And if you notice those numbers, 1, 2, 3, right next to the screw holes, that's usually an indicator, and it will be on most laptops, an indicator of what screws hold in the heatsink over the processor, so you don't tighten them all down the wrong way. It actually is a guide. It helps you as a guide. And again, once you think you have all the screws, just slowly pull up the motherboard, and you'll start to feel it if you missed one. And this should be the last one there. And just kind of jiggle it until it starts to come loose. And pops right out. And that plastic piece I pulled out is just the holder for the PCM-CIA slot. I'm going to lay something down so there's no static electricity on the motherboard when I place it down. That's just an adapter that I pulled off there for the power jack. And let's clean it while we have it out. I always take the opportunity to clean the pieces when I get them out. And I use the paintbrushes for this. You're not going to have too many chances with these laptops where you're going to get down to motherboard level, so take advantage of it while you can and make sure you get it all clean. And since you have the fan out for the processor, blow it out with compressed air. Now let's take the bottom part of the case and clean that off as well. And now, say if you did have to do a motherboard replacement, you got to start putting everything back together again. And I sped this video up because putting it back together is almost identical to taking it apart in reverse order. Put that power adapter back on. Now we're putting the screws all back on the motherboard marked with the letters PA. Put the speakers on, attach them to the motherboard. They just fit right in there, which they usually do. And that's just a battery extender. Make sure you have all the screws on that were originally on the motherboard before you put the black cover back on. And that's twice I just checked to make sure I had them all back on there, and I do now. So now I can put the cover back on. It'll usually snap right together. And now start putting the screws back in. Now, if you notice, these are screws I took out originally because I thought they were holding the hinge cover plate on. But since they're not, I could put them back on now. And then I'll put all the screws back on the top plate, or top part of the case. Attach the ribbon cable for the touchpad. Looks like I put the wrong side screw in there, so I'm going to take a couple out. And put them all back in. Sometimes you got to take a step back before you go forward. Happens to the best of them. Now put the rest of the screws in. Put that circuit board back in that has the power buttons on it, and make sure you attach the ribbon cables. Always attach your ribbon cables when you're putting things back, otherwise you have to take the whole laptop apart again. It's something that you just have to remember to do. You might get the whole thing back together and then realize the keyboard's not working because you forgot to attach the cable back to the motherboard. And we're just putting the screen on now. Now what I'm going to do, if you watch, is take a bigger screwdriver when I'm done tightening these up, because I want a little extra torque on these screws, because I don't want the screen to be flapping around. I want those screws to hold. So I just take a little bigger screwdriver and put a little extra torque into them before I put everything back. Attach the LCD cable, and now we're going to feed the wireless antenna back through the computer the same way it came out. We're going to close it up. Pull the wires through. Might as well throw the wireless card in now just to get those antenna out of the way. And they snap right back on to the little connectors there. Nothing magical about those connectors. They're very easy. Just put the RAM in. Put some remaining screws back on the bottom of the case here. Okay, let's throw the keyboard in. Attach it to the motherboard with the ribbon connector. Attach the 4 screws to hold it on. Put the hinge cover plate back on. CD drive back in. Battery in. Hard drive cover back on. And that is pretty much how you do it. Most laptops are going to follow that pattern. And that's how I do it. Now, how do you keep track of the screws you get out of a computer? This is a big question. A lot of people are afraid about doing this when they start working on laptops. The method I used to do when I started out is I create a pattern right next to the laptop. A pattern identical to the pattern in which the screws are coming out. So if one screw is to the left of another screw, I place it on the table left of that screw. And I sped the tape up here. You'll notice that a pattern starts to form of the bottom of the case. And now I know where each screw goes when I go to put them back. Some people use containers. And they'll say, every screw I take out of the bottom case, I'm going to put in container number 1. So I know that all the screws in container number 1 are used for the bottom case. And then I'll get a second container. And this will be for maybe screws on the top part of the case, or screws holding the keyboard or the screen on. And then when you're down to motherboard level, there's more screws. So you could use another case for that. And that's one way to track what screws go where. I've seen people take plastic bags and lay them down in layers. Anything on the bottom layer goes into that bag. Keyboard layer goes in that bag. The top layer goes in that bag. The motherboard layer goes in that bag. And they layer them on top of each other so they know the order in which they go back. And I've had one listener tell me he creates a diagram of the actual laptop and draws the screw holes in the diagram. And then when he takes each screw out, he just puts it in the picture of the screw hole that he drew, which I think is a pretty clever idea. And same with the motherboard. And he does that for each layer that he has to. Well, that's pretty much all you need to know for now. If you watch the case study videos, you'll see some of these techniques to put in action, and I think then you'll be ready to do it yourself.